So if you can't adequately break down the food, then it can become immunologically recognizable or immunologically problematic, to our immune system, and our immune system will react to it. And it's all because you don't have enough stomach acid to digest your food. It's so fundamental. It's so fundamental. Yeah. And so allergies are on the rise. Allergies are on the rise in kids. Allergies are on the rise in adults. Certainly one of the big reasons we're seeing them increase in adults is because they're not able to break their food down. First of all of my patients have a toxic burden, right? I'm assuming that. We all have a toxic burden. We've got organotoxins, PCB, residues, et cetera, in our body. And we also have a burden of metallotoxins as well. I just think that's been adequately demonstrated. One of the most fundamental and underappreciated ways that we can inhibit absorption of metallotoxins, and this is not just through the gut, but this is into the brain, in the brain as well, is by making sure we have adequate intake of all of our essential minerals, period. It's pretty interesting stuff. So the transport proteins that are present in the gut as well as in the blood-brain, at the blood-brain barrier, those same transport proteins that allow us to absorb minerals. This research was actually done on looking at iron specifically, but the transport proteins can actually be relatively non-specific. Like one of the main ones is called divalent transport protein 2. So there's a variety of these transport proteins, and any divalent metal ion would be able to hitch a ride in that. So a number of minerals would enter via the DMT protein, including magnesium. Iron is used in that one. A host of them. Zinc can probably hitch a ride in via DMT. But anyway, if you're deficient in these, which most of us are, most of us on a standard American diet are deficient. Lots of data on that. More of these proteins will be expressed to absorb any mineral present. And what research suggested, particularly looking at iron, was that the body there's upregulation of these proteins that are present in the gut, and then toxins can hitch a ride in here. So cadmium. I know that's absolutely huge. Fascinating. Lead. Oh, I know. Isn't that amazing? And what's really remarkable, ___, is that these same proteins are at the blood-brain barrier. The same proteins are at the blood-brain barrier. So if you're deficient in your essential elements and you increase quantities of these protein carriers, then you're going to basically give free entry of different toxins, different metallotoxins. So, I know, isn't it huge? That's a big one. Such a fundamental thing that we can do, just stay nutritionally replete.
Welcome back, everyone. It's Mike Meltzer with High Intensity Health Radio. I'm so grateful that you're with us today. We're live with Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, and we're going to talk all about allergies, autoimmunity, atopy, and the inflammatory response, which is a hot topic right now. Everyone's really concerned about allergies coming up with the spring and also autoimmunity. So I want you to understand where Dr. Kara Fitzgerald is coming from. She's a naturopathic doctor. She teaches for the Institute for Functional Medicine, and she went to naturopathic medical school at National College for Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, Oregon. And she completed her residency with one of our past guests, Dr. Cheryl Burdett, at the Progressive Medical Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And she's done a lot of work in the laboratory testing space and sees a lot of patients all throughout the world and a lot of practitioners as well. So she's kind of the doctor that doctors go to. So Dr. Fitzgerald, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we dive into allergies, autoimmunity, and fish oil and all that, let's kind of talk about your backstory. I don't really know how you got involved in integrative functional medicine and naturopathic medicine.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do like to talk about it. Cut me off if I go on for too long. I think we all have pretty interesting stories, usually kind of tugs a little bit at the heartstrings. Mine, although I have kind of a generational, influence towards natural medicine. My grandmother and subsequently my mom were both aware of organics, growing our own food. Having a garden was de rigueur, I think, for a lot of people in generations past. Now it's sort of this chic phenomena, but, so we grew up with this. We grew up with growing our own food. We grew up with composting, and my mom grew up with that with her grandmother. And they were both influenced by Adele Davis, kind of a huge nutritionist in the 60s, 70s, and So I took vitamins. My mom gave me brewer's yeast, and we had to do mail order for organics back then. My mom was also trained as a nurse, and we ended up taking way too many antibiotics too. So on one hand, we had this wonderful foundation, lots of dirt in my life, lots of outdoors and good foods, but we also took antibiotics for, little sneezes and stuff like that. I mean, she really thought she was doing the right thing. And there's plenty of allergic disease in my family that we've had to deal with. Atopy is big. So hay fever, asthma, eczema, and so forth. You'll see it in my family quite a bit, and it's something that I've wrestled with to a certain extent. I got off relatively easy, but that's really one of the big backstories. I think I just was carrying on the tradition from my family lineage.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So before we dive into allergies and atopy, you have a recent blog post on SIBO and the link between SIBO and chapped lips. So it just really intrigued me. It's on the tip of my mind. Let's dive into that.
Okay. All right. Absolutely. So that, a lot of what we learn, my colleagues and I, we're in the trenches. We're seeing patients. We're needing to, really think on our feet when we see these conditions. And so I had a patient, a 24-year-old, lovely young woman, who presented to me with a real classic SIBO picture, and it was confirmed with her breath test. And so that was her primary issue. It's extremely painful. It can be pretty debilitating. And she had it for really about a decade, long time. So it came on in her middle teens. And also, at the same time, she reported in her history, she also developed, what I would call exfoliative cheilitis. So beyond chapped lips, this is like just an incredible peeling and healing of her lips. Just open lesions, just so painful. If you go to my blog, you can actually see the photographs she sent to me not too long ago. So we were able to clear out the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, with diet, with botanicals. We didn't use any pharmaceuticals with her, gave her appropriate nutrients. All of that's outlined in my blog. That's sort of a separate topic. It's an interesting topic and an important topic, but the chapped lips were the big story here. So we dealt with the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and she gently reminded me that she still had these horrible chapped lips. And she actually lives, she's a few states away, so I didn't see her in person. She sent me a reminder photograph, and she said, my lips are still terrible. What can we do? And as I say in my blog, it's a head scratcher for me. Geez, she really has this incredible case of chapped lips, and she's, versed in all of the myriad topicals you can apply, so shea butter and coconut and, even petroleum and, just on and on. So I was reflecting on her case. I needed to advise her on the next steps, and I was reflecting on her case and looking back in her history, and just saw this association with the onset of the chapped lips with the onset of the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and that really just sent me thinking. And she also would have periodic coating on her tongue, which suggests potential for thrush or some sort of a microbial imbalance there. And so my question became, there's a temporal association, so could there be some sort of a dysbiosis of the lips going on? Could this be a bacterial imbalance as well? Really, it's beyond garden variety chapped lips. The other piece is, were these nutrient deficiencies? Is this a sign of significant nutrient deficiencies? And sometimes changes to the lips, which we call cheilitis, angular cheilitis, it can be nutrient deficiencies, and we can correct those. And I tried nutrients with her, actually. And I was not able to turn it around. So riboflavin, B vitamins, those can cause angular cheilitis or contribute to chapped lips. And you can actually see deficiencies like that in small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So we tried that. That would be the lowest hanging fruit, the most obvious thing. Aggressive doses of B vitamins. Didn't really work in her case. Actually, it didn't work. So then I started to think about the bacterial association, the potential. And so I go in the literature. I'm a little bit of a research junkie, as you know. I know you are too. And there is indeed, some association, particularly in immunocompromised people, so like HIV patients and stuff like that, where there is exfoliative cheilitis, or different forms of really bad chapped lips associated with bacterial imbalances. And I saw a handful of case reports, and it was enough for me to say, maybe that's what we're dealing with. So maybe if we go after this from a functional perspective, from an integrative perspective, where we're doing, a safe antimicrobial botanical oil-based formulation for her lips. Let's just, I'm just, kind of making this up as I go along. Let's try opening some berberine capsules and putting them in coconut oil and really applying them liberally, applying this formula liberally to her lips. She was really excited about it and said, do you mind if I add some probiotics to this mixture as well? And I said, hey, sounds good to me. So we came up with this formula, and she applied it regularly, and her lips turned around. She did say that if she slowed down an application, like if she she was applying it maybe 3-4 times a day, or she is applying it 3 or 4 times a day. And if she missed a few applications, she would notice that they would start to peel again. But she sent me a follow-up picture, and you can see it. We totally turned it around. And this is something, Mike, that was so painful for her. So laughing, eating, smiling, just this constant peeling. And, I'm thrilled that so far so good. I mean, I just spoke with her maybe last week or the week before, and she's still doing very well.
Wow, that's amazing. Just thinking outside the box.
Yeah. I mean, clinical practice puts us into those positions. I mean, you really need to be willing to expand your boundaries and, reach out to colleagues, see what other people are doing. And it's also nice to have my blog as a place where I can publish these cases. And a lot of, you'll see in my blog a lot of times I'm bringing in these cases, my patient cases in my practice, what I'm seeing and what I'm thinking about. It's a neat forum for that. Mm-hmm.
So if you were to kind of go back and look at the etiology or the mechanism here, would we say that there was dysbiosis of the mouth, and using the oral supplement antimicrobial botanicals wasn't addressing the microbial colonies in the mouth, and so that local administration was kind of what helped? Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah, that would be my working theory. If she had been in practice, here in my office in front of me, I could have taken a swab, and actually cultured it and see, if there's anything imbalanced growing out. That would have been kind of neat to be, more rigorous. But she wasn't. She's in a lot of pain, and she's not local, and so we just needed to deal.
Right.
So
totally got
it. That's what we did, and it worked. Yeah.
That's great. Now, What about coconut oil pulling? I've recently kind of learned about that from John Duyard and stuff. Would that be something you'd recommend just for preventative microbial health of the mouth?
I think that I haven't tried it myself. I have a couple of patients who really swear by it. It's an interesting idea. I would say, sure, if it works for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, we tend to focus on the gut so much and forget about the mouth.
Right. Well, and for her, so you know what, Mike? Let me say that she originally she had reported seeing coating and stuff like that. So evidence of her oral mucosa or her mouth being imbalanced. But that actually, the mouth turned around with the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth treatment. So we did address that. She no longer complained of thrush or any coating and so forth. Mm-hmm. It was really limited to the lips. So I think we're looking at, maybe a dysbiosis of the lips. I know.
Interesting.
I know, it's interesting. So that's where we focused our therapy.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Well, everyone should definitely check out your blog. Can you plug that URL just in case people hop off?
Yes, it's easy. It's just drkarafitzgerald.com. So drkarafitzgerald.com. And in and this blog, my most recent blog is on allergy testing, so food allergies, and some interesting thoughts around that, on how we see the clinical presentation of food allergies actually change with time. And again, this is, being in the trenches in my practice, and then also trying to put some evidence around it. So take a look at that and let me know what you think.
Perfect.
All right.
We'll have that. So let's kind of dive into one thing I've learned from you, Dr. Fitzgerald, and this was at the first inflammatory module with the advanced practitioner module with Institute for Functional Medicine. You talked about this inflammatory continuum, and I think people have this perception that they either have autoimmunity or they don't. They have allergies or they don't, but you teach it a totally different perspective, more functional. So talk to us about that.
Well, I think that I would say that most of us in the West have some allergic bias, some sort of evidence of immune system dominance, to one extent or the other. So yeah, it's not an on or off switch. You can have early immune imbalances that don't yet present as full on clinical disease, but may make you vulnerable to clinical disease later on, and something clinically relevant, some kind of problem in your life. So you can have the functional imbalances that will allow you to later develop allergic disease or autoimmune disease. Both allergic disease and autoimmune disease we can say are immune system dominant. So immune system imbalanced and on overdrive. Whereas some folks might be more immunosuppression or inhibited. It might be a more pathogen dominated condition. They can't fight infections well. Whereas on the allergic and autoimmune continuum, there's an overactive immune response. So yes, from a functional perspective, we want to get in there early and sort of tend to those imbalances, just tend to the garden, pull the weeds out so that we can prevent either allergic disease worsening or the expression of autoimmune disease and so forth. So, think about it as a continuum. And unfortunately, most of us in the West do have what we would call antecedent factors. We do have vulnerabilities that set us up for these conditions. That's why they're both epidemic, huge,
Yeah. Now, what some of these early signs or symptoms that people might experience maybe in early life? Would this be like seasonal allergies? Would this be gas and bloating, headaches? Like, what are some things that may be a red flag that would lead people to, that they should maybe see a healthcare practitioner to kind of explore these in a little bit more functional?
Any of those, really. I mean, if you've already got seasonal allergies, then you've got a classic, allergic disease. You want to get in there before seasonal allergies are there or before they're too bad, but most of us have them. So any of those signs and symptoms suggest imbalance. So seasonal allergies are the body's overreaction to something really benign, pollen, as different plants come into season. So why? The question, why is your body really overreacting to this compound that it shouldn't be? I mean, I was just talking about this morning. In fact, I'll be lecturing on this very topic, this coming weekend in California at the Immune Module. It's actually it's actually upon us. I mean, seasonal allergies, hay fever wasn't around in the early 1800s. I mean, it was non-existent. Hay fever, it wasn't a word. And then it was epidemic by the end of the 1800s. So it went from not being recognized. There was the first report of it in the medical literature in the early 1800s. And then after a little while, it's epidemic. Oh my gosh, what's going on? Why are all these people reacting to pollen? I mean, it shouldn't be. And there's a few reasons, and we're going to talk about those. But the big thing that they point their finger at back then in the 1800s was the movement into the Industrial Revolution. So the exposure to petroleum derivatives, so pollution, smokestacks, and burning coal, and all of these organotoxins, or mercury would be in the coal too. So all of this massive toxin exposure really caused us to kind of shift our immune system in such a way that made us start reacting to compounds that we shouldn't. So lots of exposure to pollution sets the immune system up in an imbalanced way that makes it, way more reactive to pollen or, cat dander, dog dander, dust mites, etc. The list goes on and on, what we become reactive to. So that was one of the fundamental imbalances.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's so what I hear you saying is these toxins. I mean, if we could nerd out a little bit and talk about kind of the mechanism, like how does, say, petrochemicals, persistent organic pollutants, like what are they really doing to the immune system? Is it like, are they hitting receptors and causing, like, talk to us about kind of like how this happens?
Well, there's so many different toxins, and first of all, the allergic response to toxins, I think, is a first line response to getting the toxin out of the body. So
Mm-hmm.
really any of them. I mean, think about it. You're sneezing, your nose is running. I mean, it's like this first line reaction to this compound is bad. This compound is something that I don't want in my body. And I think that's why allergies, we see the allergic symptoms as, you know, closely associated with initial toxicity exposure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, and so then mechanistically, we would see these same compounds, having just allowing the allergic arm of the immune system to be stronger. I mean, the immune system is pretty remarkably complex, and the different arms of the immune system and the different cells and the different cytokines and chemokines and so forth, so sort of regulate one another. You release a little bit of this and you inhibit that, and you turn on this and you turn off that. And what ends up happening is there's this dysregulation. So there's a less responsive arm of the immune system that's going to go after infectious disease, and there's an increased responsiveness that will start reacting to these benign compounds, this allergic response. So that's one piece of the puzzle with regard to toxins. Is that adequate?
No, that's great. I was just curious about that. I mean, I think Vojdani talks about heavy metals, and they induce cross-reactive molecular mimicry. So I didn't really know how. You talk a lot about toxicity, which I think is really cool. So I was just kind of wondering.
Yeah, that is certainly Vojdani articulates that nicely. The cross-reactive molecular mimicry. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Interesting. That's really great. So let's kind of talk about, I think a lot of, this is what I hear from practitioners, Dr. Fitzgerald, is, I put my patient on a gluten-free, wheat-free, corn-free, soy-free diet, and they're still sick. And what I heard you just say is, well, the toxicity component is, that's an allergen. We kind of look at those things differently, unfortunately. So, any tips or strategies, the best elimination, ways to, I guess, prevent exposure to these compounds, but also once we know we're all toxic, like what do you find as a practitioner is the best way to enhance the body's ability to excrete these things that we're all exposed to?
Well, so first of all, just basic clean living guidelines, as I'm sure you've talked about here many times, would be the best way to eliminate, reduce your exposure. And secondly, the other very foundational way that we can inhibit or we can reduce the problems associated with toxins is to make sure that we're nutritionally replete. So one of the most fundamental and underappreciated ways that we can inhibit absorption of metallotoxins, and this is not just through the gut, but this is into the brain, in the brain as well, is by making sure we have adequate intake of all of our essential minerals. Period. It's pretty interesting stuff. So the transport proteins that are present in the gut as well as in the blood-brain at the blood-brain barrier, those same transport proteins that allow us to absorb minerals. This research was actually done on looking at iron specifically, but the transport proteins can actually be relatively non-specific. Like one of the main ones is called divalent transport protein 2. So there's a variety of these transport proteins, and any divalent metal, ion would be able to hitch a ride in that. So a number of minerals would enter via the DMT protein, including magnesium. Iron is used in that one. A host of them. Zinc can probably hitch a ride in via DMT. But anyway, if you're deficient in these, which most of us on a standard American diet are deficient. I mean, lots of data on that. More of these proteins will be expressed to absorb any mineral present. And what research suggested, particularly looking at iron, was that the body there's upregulation of these proteins that are present in the gut, and then toxins can hitch a ride in here. So cadmium. I know it's It's
That's
absolutely
huge.
fascinating.
Oh my
Lead.
gosh.
I know. Isn't that amazing? And what's really remarkable, underscore, 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 is that these same proteins are at the blood-brain barrier. The same proteins are at the blood-brain barrier. So if you're deficient in your essential elements and you increase quantities of these protein carriers, then you're going to basically give free entry of different toxins, different metallotoxins. So, see, I know, isn't it huge?
That's a big one.
Such a fundamental thing that we can do, just stay nutritionally replete. And not only, when I approach, first of all of my patients have a toxic burden, right? I'm assuming that we all have a toxic burden. We've got organotoxins, PCB residues, et cetera, in our body. And we also have a burden of metallotoxins as well. I mean, I just think that's been adequately demonstrated. So there's a couple of questions the clinician needs to ask. First of all, is that toxic burden, or how relevant is that toxic burden to the pathogenesis of this particular patient? How big, if I'm pie charting all the factors that are playing into that person's condition, how big a piece of the pie is going to toxin exposures now? So that's always a question of mine, and that will dictate how aggressively I go after them with detox. Am I going to use DMSA? Are we going to be really doing some heavy duty sauna, et cetera, et cetera? So that's one question that I need to ask. But for all of my patients, regardless, I'm going to look for current exposures in their environment and get rid of those. And we're going to do all of these foundational functional interventions. All of them. Make sure that they're nutritionally replete, make sure their minerals are up to snuff, make sure they have adequate vitamins, make sure all of their amino acids are intact, make sure, I'm sure you've talked about methylation, make sure methylation, glutathione conjugation, all of our phase 2 detox pathways are really up and running. And when you do foundational interventions, foundational nutrient interventions, plus you dial in the diet, you're addressing all of this, and you're preparing the body to be able to either remove the compounds themselves because their liver is now functioning, their detox systems are now functioning, and they move these things out themselves, or for a subset of individuals, they are then ready to go into more aggressive detox. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at it in all of my patients, but I am kind of sorting out, who is in need of what. So I'm not going to go after aggressive detoxification in anyone immediately. I'm going to do all those foundational functional interventions first, and then we'll figure out who needs to have the volume turned up around the detox. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Beautifully said. No, that's amazing. And I've never heard anyone talk about this. And I want to make sure people really understand what we're saying here. So you take two people, one's nutrient depleted, one's, has sufficient micronutrients, and they're exposed to the same level of toxin. The one person that's micronutrient depleted is going to absorb more and more of those toxins because they have more mineral receptors. And you talk about, then to add insult to injury, they're going to have a harder time eliminating those toxins because we know these micronutrients are involved in detoxification. So we can see this vicious cycle building up.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And this research, I know, and it would be interesting to continue, sky's the limit with this research and actually looking at this association, but the original data were around iron deficiency, which incidentally is huge in our female, our premenopausal and perimenopausal female population, just allowing for the rapid absorption of cadmium, of lead, into circulation and then into the central nervous system. Yeah. And what's incredible, Mike, is that it's a really easy fix. It's an easy fix to get people, replete in their nutrients.
Let's talk about that. That's my next question.
Okay. How to get people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different camps, right? There's the whole food camp, which, I'm a part of, eat real food and so forth. But we also know that our food's not what it used to be. So where do you kind of draw the line as a clinician? Okay, you eat all this real food, but then we need to supplement too. Like, what's your approach?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I am in favor of real food. Of course, I mean, who isn't? That's kind of funny. Perhaps that's a funny answer. But I do think micronutrient, pinpointed micronutrient prescriptions are appropriate, and I do a good deal of laboratory testing. I did my postdoc. So in addition to the residency that I completed with Dr. Burdett, I also did a postdoc in laboratory science where we investigated, all of these micronutrient deficiencies, and incidentally, we looked at toxin exposures as well. So I've spent a lot of time in that in my life, and I carried it over into clinical practice because I really saw the utility of it time and again when I was in the laboratory. So let's identify exactly what the patient needs. Let's look under the hood. Let's look under their hood. Really look at these micronutrient insufficiencies, and let's look at the biochemical ramifications. We can do that investigating, amino acids, organic acids. We can look at fatty acids. So it's like looking at the metabolome, the proteome, a lot of those cool words. I mean, we can really map out what's happening, and then from that we can determine whether or not dietary correction is adequate, or do we need to go with micronutrients for a period of time and then taper them off? It shouldn't be a lifetime need. I mean, I do think there are some fundamental nutrients that all of us should probably be taking, like probiotics, unless you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and avoid those until that's corrected. But probiotics are a good thing. Essential fatty acids, we tend not to get up to adequate amounts in our diet, and so we need supplementation. But it doesn't have to be a lifetime thing. But pinpointed micronutrient prescriptions, I think, are essential to addressing individuals who have these complex chronic conditions. And since we're talking about immune system dominance, we're talking allergy and, autoimmunity here. Deficiencies are de rigueur in both of those conditions. Nutrient deficiencies are always found.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, I think I would infer from your postdoc research that you would tend to lean towards organic acid testing. Would that be your go-to for micronutrient testing?
Well, it's one of them. I think it's good fun, and I think patients actually really enjoy looking at what's happening. For those of you who remember biochemistry, Krebs cycle, and making ATP, and looking at pyruvate and lactate, and the compounds that allow us to shuttle carnitine. So looking at fatty acid metabolism. So we're looking at different points in the mitochondria and our ability to generate energy. I think organic acids can be a really useful tool. Not the only tool, but certainly one of the standard investigations that I make. Yeah.
Great. And what I found, I've never had anyone explain this to me. So an organic acid test, for those that don't know, is just a one snapshot urine. But how does that reflect, over the course? Is it pretty stable over time? Like, if I have the same micronutrient deficiencies and I don't replete them, I'm going to have a very similar expression on my organic acid test?
Well, it should be sufficiently reproducible. So these do change. They do change, and some of them have very fast half-life. Some of them change quicker than others. So there is allowable variability, but a good-sized nutrition deficiency should always show up as increased presence of certain organic acids. And let me give you the most classic example, and that would be in B12 deficiency, there's an accumulation of a compound called methylmalonic acid. So methylmalonic acid is a precursor, actually. It does, it's a precursor to a handful of things in the body, but it goes on to make succinyl-CoA, which is actually part of the Krebs cycle. So it goes on to feed the Krebs cycle in a way. And there's a B12 dependent enzyme. So methylmalonic acid in its entry into the Krebs cycle has this B12 dependent step. So if there isn't adequate B12, methylmalonic acid is going to accumulate in the body. So there's inadequate B12 to actually convert it into succinyl-CoA, and then there's a whole lot of methylmalonic, and then it spills into the urine. Or it could be high in the blood. You could look at it in the urine or in blood, and you can infer from this elevated MMA that B12 is needed, and that's been shown time and again to be sensitive and specific for B12 deficiency. There is actually a genetic mutation that can occur where there'd be a whole ton of MMA in the urine, but that A is rare, and B, even if you saw that, you would still want to support it with B12. So that's a nice sensitive specific indicator, and you should see that consistently Yeah, so it should be reproducible.
Perfect. And for someone just wanting to maintain optimal health, I mean, maybe they have allergies and so forth, but like for you and me, healthy people that are just trying to function optimally, would you suggest this test once a year, twice a year, once every other year? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say I think it's a nice annual investigation. I think it's useful annually. Sometimes when I'm working with folks who have a specific condition we're addressing, maybe every 6 months. But as a rule, in somebody just working on wellness, I would say annually. Incidentally, since we're kind of diverging over to organic acids, it's really great for optimizing performance. I think you're kind of an athlete, right? And you probably, I'm sure, yeah, you are. I see your Facebook pictures. Everyone climb mountains or something.
Right.
So the same, you can see these same imbalances in athletes, who are really using, who have tons of mitochondria because they're making lots of energy, and you can see some of these same imbalances, and you can correct them and optimize wellness and potentially improve performance for the competitive athlete, possibly support, maybe shaving a couple seconds off their time, but, certainly setting them up for a good solid season. When I was in the lab, we used to work with a lot of athletes, and I was a competitive cyclist when I was in med school, so I appreciate the utility of these tests for that. It's actually, and it's fun. They're fun to do. They're interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Nice tip there. Awesome. Okay, so we talked about micronutrients and their role. We've talked about toxins, but let's look at hidden toxins like food additives. I know that's something that you really like to stress on, and I think people are aware of like MSG, but what are some other hidden food additives that you find?
I mean, anything, unfortunately. I mean, you really want to go as close to the original food as possible. And it depends on, again, Mike, it really depends on the individual. So some people are going to have to basically, make their food at home for quite a while until some resilience is developed. For other folks, they may be able to tolerate additives. In my experience, MSG is a pretty common issue for folks, and we need to just avoid it altogether. But I would say, as a rule, avoid, make sure that you understand what you're eating, and that you recognize the terms, and that if you don't, either make the product at home or avoid it. The gray area that you're getting into a little bit, Mike, is that there are food allergies. So we're talking about allergies, and you're moving a little bit into intolerance. So an MSG would be more of an intolerance. So it's not necessarily an immunological reaction. It sets off a different cascade of mechanisms. It's actually still ultimately inflammatory, but the mechanism by which we react to it is different than a classic allergy. There's histamines in foods that are another potential issue for patients. Histamine intolerance. So again, it's not an allergy. It's an inability to actually break down histamine in some cases, or it's just a particular sensitivity to histamine that can actually present pretty closely to an allergic response. So you could have asthma, you could have something that really looks like eczema. Another common finding in food, and it's not even histamine is just in food. I mean, it's not, it's not an additive. It's just present, and it can set you up. In histamine intolerant people, it can be a problem. But the other thing would be nickel. People who have contact dermatitis, so you can't tolerate wearing certain jewelry, cheap jewelry. Those folks who get a rash probably have a nickel sensitivity. And there's a whole host of foods out there that have nickel present in them, like chocolate is a big one for nickel. I know. And if I know it's a real bummer. If it's an issue, if you're nickel intolerant. So, I think that, the challenge for the clinician is to identify what is happening. What is the person reacting to? Are we looking at just allergic disease? Are we looking at, allergic disease with the possibility of some intolerances kind of folded in there? And it's up to us as clinicians to really kind of figure that out. And my statement, because I know there's a lot of regular folks listening to your podcast, would be that if you're struggling with what you think are allergies, but you've done a lot of the traditional investigations, you may need to go for some of these more pointed investigations. And I would, I'd recommend, if possible, working with a good clinician who's aware of these. Otherwise, you can have you can really limit your diet. I mean, you can make your life pretty miserable by going after a number of these things, thinking they're going to work for you. Mm-hmm. I actually, since I've talked a lot mainstream about allergies, I get a handful of folks coming to me who have done just this for themselves. They've tried to eliminate a ton of different classes of foods because they've heard it on the internet, and it can be overwhelming. And actually, it leads me to another word of caution, and that is that you could potentially become chances are you're already nutrient insufficient to one degree or another. And if you do really limit your diet considerably in attempt to treat yourself, you could become very nutrient depleted and actually have that much of a harder time recovering from the illness. So I would absolutely recommend whole foods. And one of the things you certainly could do at home would be to eliminate, the top problem foods. There's nothing wrong with going gluten-free and dairy-free, soy. You could think about pulling out citrus if you're concerned about that. Fish, certain nuts can be a problem. So these are the top antigenic foods. You could trial that. You could go full on paleo and see how you do. Actually, pull legumes out for a while. You should be able to do that in a way that you can maintain an adequate, a nutritious diet. But after that, once you start getting into some of these other potential reactions, I would suggest seeing if you can work with a clinician who's familiar with these things.
Yeah, that's a good point. And something you talk about in your lectures and so forth with IFM is the role of digestion. So people can be eating a low allergen diet and so forth, but if they have hyperchlorhydria or low stomach acid, they're fermenting things in a wrong way. Do you want to talk about the role of digestion and making sure that we don't?
Yeah, that's great. I feel like when we're talking about so many areas, I need a PowerPoint behind me so we can outline and tell you what your priorities are and so forth. Yeah, digestion is huge. So if we go all the way back to talking about what predisposes us to allergic disease, now we're talking about toxins because toxins are fundamental, but as fundamental would be disturbances in our microbiome, which are going to cause a bias towards an allergic response in many of us. So let's come back. I'm going to hold that over there, sure. And you can bring us back to. So when we're thinking about gut, when we're thinking about digestion, you have to be thinking about the microbiome and immune imbalances caused by a disrupted microbiome. But just answering your question around digestion, yeah, it's huge. So with regard to allergic disease, absolutely, there's an increased incidence in classic allergy. So I eat wheat and I get hives, or I get eczema, or my lips swell up, or I can't breathe. So this classic allergic response when we have low stomach acid. And of course, proton pump inhibitors, H2 blockers are huge drugs these days. They're one of they're the top 5, I think. At least top 10 prescribed, probably top 5. So we're inhibiting stomach acid in, we're globally, really. And once you do that, just as you alluded to, you inhibit the body's ability to break down proteins. So the wheat that you would eat, perhaps, and tolerate. Now you're not breaking it down adequately, and so then that protein fragment that enters into the that's going to be picked up by, or looked at by the immune system. It's larger than it should be, and it's going to look like a problem. So again, it's a benign compound. It's a benign food. Maybe wheat's not a good example these days because we're all totally gluten free. But let's take potato, or let's take many of the normal food, rice even. I mean, so if you can't adequately break down the food, then it can become immunologically recognizable or immunologically problematic, to our immune system, and our immune system will react to it. And it's all because you don't have enough stomach acid to digest your food. It's so fundamental. Yeah, and so allergies are on the rise. Allergies are on the rise in kids. Allergies are on the rise in adults. Certainly one of the big reasons we're seeing them increase in adults is because they're not able to break their food down.
Mm-hmm.
Factor in, I know. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was going to say, I come from old school mentors where you dose hydrochloric acid until you feel a burning. You're on the cutting edge here. What do you recommend for people? I mean, just chew your food, be mindful. Where do we go with healing, getting stomach acid to where it needs to be?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, both of your things. Yeah, and yeah. I do. I think an HCl titration is great. But now, if you're somebody who's been taking a proton pump inhibitor, or if you've been taking some kind of an acid blocker for a while, you can't just jump into HCl. So again, it's important that you have appropriate guidance for this. Just since we've talked about SIBO a lot today, that's another condition that's associated with hypochlorhydria, as it's called, low stomach acid. So I will have, for most of my patients, I will have them do an HCl titration, or for those who I think have low stomach acid. And, it's the classic presentation is bloating, abdominal pain, lots of gas after eating, and so forth. Those are some of our signs for low HCl. And, the other thing I want to throw out is that when we don't, it's one of our first line immune responses. So the way that we kill microbes that we don't want hanging around is we blast them with our stomach acid. They're on the food, we eat them, and then we blast them with stomach acid. We just break them down. They're not and they're not a problem. So another problem with inadequate HCl, either via meds or just via poor eating habits, as you were pointing out, not chewing, not resting and digesting, and so forth. All the myriad reasons we can have low stomach acid, we are also taking away that first line immune response, that ability to kill the bugs, and then this will lead to dysbiosis, and it actually can be pretty significantly problematic, both in the small and the large intestine, in the stomach, small intestine, large intestine. So that will further disturb the microbiome, also, lending itself to the whole underlying pathogenesis of allergic disease, of autoimmune disease, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was taught that we need acidic chyme to activate cholecystokinin and GLP-1 and all these different hormones that will then release bile. And we know bile is antimicrobial as well. So we have this really upstream effect, this cascade, where, as you mentioned, dysbiosis is really critical here. And how we introduced this call was SIBO and, dysbiosis in the mouth. So simple fix.
Well, yeah, Mike, I know. You're absolutely right. It's this cascade of reflexes of, this sort of symphony of events. And it starts with, appropriate digestion. As that whole adequate, that whole cascade starts with actually cephalic digestion. You've probably heard that concept before. This is actually thinking about what you're going to eat. As soon as you start thinking about eating, you start salivating a little bit, right? And you're bringing amylase into you're bringing the enzymes present in the saliva ready to do their thing. I mean, you just create this cascade. Stomach starts sequestering hydrogens to drop the pH. Pancreas is getting ready. Gallbladder. I mean, it's all getting ready to receive food. Yeah. And that's how we evolved. I mean, it's just so fundamental. And we also evolved doing this in a parasympathetic state. So in a relative calm do we eat, and that's when we can digest optimally. Most of us live in some degree of sympathetic dominance now, where we don't want to digest. When you're running away from the tiger, if you go back to evolution, if you're running away from a tiger, or trying to fight, I mean, you're not going to digest. I mean, you don't want to put the massive amount of energy it takes to break down food, towards that. You want to have the energy in your muscles and, to be able to move, do whatever. And so that's sympathetic dominance. Digestion is inhibited. So there's very fundamental steps that we can take to digest normally. I remember my mentor, Dr. Richard Lord at the laboratory he's so good at taking his time out for lunch, and actually really practicing, all of the stages of digestion. He was good about that. I mean, he'd often, he'd be gone for a little portion of lunch. It'd be funny if he'll hear this, but he would absolutely fess up, and he'd go take a little bit of a nap at the end of his meal just to kind of allow that full process of digestion to occur.
That's amazing.
Rather than some of us who would, still be working and eating,
or driving or whatever else,
driving.
Right?
Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah, I found, for me, I guess I'm interested in this because I have this problem. I like to eat, but I also like to work and do things. So it's really challenging, I think, to sit down. It's an exercise that we all have to work on. And like you said, go back to like how our ancestors ate. They didn't have the drive-thrus and the computers and Facebook, and would sit down in groups and chew their food, and it was a long process. So thanks for sharing that story with Dr. Lord. That's really great information there.
He really practices what he preaches. He does.
I love that.
Okay.
So last two questions here, Dr. Fitzgerald. If there was just one nutrient, herb, or botanical, like you're going on a trip tomorrow to California, right? What's one thing that you just would not leave at home? One nutrient, supplement, or botanical?
I would say that I am... and I actually know I can get it out there because I know there'll be some good vendors and I'll grab their samples, but I'm cheating. But I would say that one of the nutrients I think is so important, and I mentioned this before, are our essential fatty acids. And primarily EPA and DHA, but alpha lipoic is good. Gamma-linolenic is also good. But I would say EPA and DHA are so important in having enough and having our membranes adequately stocked. So that's a nutrient that I never want to be too far away from.
Right. And I guess we could talk about, since you mentioned it, I didn't know if you were going to pick that one or not, the effect that alpha or EPA DHA have on our intracellular signaling pathways when it comes to modulating the inflammatory response. You want to kind of talk about that just briefly, like how they work to reduce inflammation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's huge. It's a huge, huge, huge topic, and it's evolving. So the nice thing about it, like the take home for patients and for clinicians treating people, is that we do want to give EPA and DHA. We need it, and we're still biased towards too many omega-6s or too high omega-6 relative to omega-3. So we want to continue to support that. So our treatment isn't changing. We do want to make sure you give adequate amounts, though, in inflammatory diseases, i.e. allergy, autoimmunity, being two of the biggies. So I generally go with about 3 grams. That's maybe 3 to 5, sometimes a little bit higher in different situations. So that's as an aside. But what are they doing? So the field of lipidology, studying what lipids do, lipid biochemistry, is it's exploding. I think it always is, but we're really learning a lot around these anti-inflammatory compounds. They're called, as a group, there's tons of them. They're called lipid mediators. So eicosanoids would fit in this. So we know the pro-inflammatory eicosanoids produced from arachidonic acid, the prostaglandins, the leukotrienes. They're extremely important mediators of all things inflammation. They're fundamental to all things inflammation, really all things, even when different arms of the immune system are triggering the inflammation. So if it's an allergic inflammation versus an autoimmune inflammation versus, think about cardiovascular or diabetes, et cetera, any type of inflammatory condition is going to have, as one of its fundamental players, these eicosanoids derived from arachidonic acid. Fundamental. So we're thinking always about how do we reduce the effect of these. And so an emerging understanding are these this class of lipid mediators, and I colloquially refer to them as a group as the resolvins, and that is because they're pro-resolving lipid mediator. These guys come in after the acute phase of the inflammatory response, and they clean it up. They stop it, and they come in and they clean it up. So current thinking is that chronic inflammation is a failure of resolution. A failure of resolution. And current thinking is that the resolution of inflammation isn't just that things wind down, and go away. It's as active and has as many compounds involved as does inflammation. So there's this cleanup phase that occurs after the main event, and if that's not allowed to happen, the chronic inflammation ensues. So major, and the resolvins, the major player resolvins are coming from EPA and DHA. EPA and DHA. These are from EPA are the resolvins themselves, and then from DHA, we have the protectins, we have the neuroprotectins, the mauricins. There's a whole, there's many of these compounds. Many. I mean, they're all just slightly different in structure. Some of them aren't biologically active, but many of them are. So, and these are present in the immune cells. These are present in macrophages and eosinophils, in the various PMNs. So white blood cells have the ingredients to then clean up and turn off inflammation. And they're made from primarily EPA and DHA, but other players can make them as well. There's actually lipoxins from arachidonic acid. So even arachidonic acid itself can produce some of these pro-resolving lipid mediators as well. I know, it's incredible stuff, Mike. It's so interesting. In fact, you might be aware of the various traumatic brain injury case reports. I think that there were 3 of them over in 2013 and 2014. There may be more now, but they actually treated these. So traumatic brain injury can also, the lasting damage associated with TBI is the inflammation that ensues. So in a handful of these case reports, I think Sanjay Gupta even did a story on it. It was big news last year. They gave very high dose of EPA and DHA. We're talking 20 grams or 20,000 milligrams, right? I mean, and they put them in the feed tubes of these individuals with traumatic brain injury. So these guys were in the hospital, and they were out, and actually, at least in one, they were not expected to survive. So they did very aggressive dosing of EPA and DHA, and in these reports were able to turn patients around. And it's suspected that these pro-resolving lipid mediators were a big piece of that. So these, just providing massive amounts of these neuroprotectins and protectins and mauricins, and the data is out. Mostly in animal studies. It's still evolving. There are some human studies, but showing that how they work with the microglial cells, the astrocytes, just the extracellular matrix, and balance it out, turn off excitotoxicity, attenuate NMDA activity, glutamatergic excitotoxicity, and actually promote upregulation of our detox system. So central nervous system glutathione, actually peripheral as well. And it goes on and on and on and on. So you'll see us thinking about and moving towards these compounds. Eventually, ideally, we'll be able to measure them, so we make sure people are producing adequate amounts, and we'll think about ways to promote production of them. So there are the ones that are aspirin induced. So we think now one of the mechanisms of baby aspirin being an effective anti-inflammatory compound is not just in its ability to reduce clot formation by inhibiting thromboxanes, but it promotes production of these lipid mediators. It promotes production, and it's a baby aspirin. It's not a full dose, but around 75 to 81 milligrams. It seems to promote these, and then still some people can be irritated by aspirin. They're actually called aspirin-triggered resolvins or lipid mediators. So some folks are still irritated by it. And so, my thinking as a naturopathic physician are, what are the aspirin-like botanicals that might promote this as well? And so, of course, white willow comes to mind. But it certainly argues in favor of considering baby aspirin as we start to understand these lipid mediators. They're so incredible, just incredible players. And they've been there all along, and now we're starting to understand them and what they do. So That's stay great. On the horizon. But it's an argument for making sure we have enough of our omega-3s, really, because we're in an imbalanced world.
Yeah, a lot of great nuggets to take away from that, Dr. Fitzgerald. But I think the biggest one for me was that chronic inflammation is not so much an overactive immune system. It's really the inability to take out the trash, to clean up, so to speak, and that it's really orchestrated. So I think we don't think about that. We just think, oh, you're inflamed. You have the triggers on, but it's like, well, but we need to turn the brakes on more. And so that's kind of...
Yeah. And it's not going to switch what we do, Mike, so much. Turning the brakes on for inflammation will still be improving our diet. We'll be making sure that we're replete in our nutrients and so forth. But there's a big paradigm shift with, regard to how we're thinking about inflammation. How do we actually get involved in the very active process of resolving inflammation? Yeah.
That's really great.
It is. It's interesting.
Awesome stuff there, Dr. Fitzgerald. So last question, if you were to bump shoulders in an elevator with Barack Obama or a congressman, and they just turned to you and said, hey, as a clinician, how can I improve the health of America? What would you say to them, and why?
The very first thing that came to mind that I'll just say for the sake of time, because obviously...
It's many topics, right?
Yeah. Well, obviously in affordable care, we should have just fundamental access to functional medicine practitioners should be a given. So, in the political landscape, we should be really the first line, the primary care doctors, functional medicine, generalists. But, I have to say, I just go back to thinking about this blog that I wrote. Because it was such an eye opener for me. I mean, again, going back to all of these micronutrient deficiencies we have, we're depleted. We don't have adequate magnesium. We don't have adequate zinc. I mean, just on and on and on. If you look at just data from the USDA and FDA, you'll see that we just never get, and we're talking RDA amount, we never get our recommended daily allowance, and it's incredible. And so I was thinking about potassium quite a bit last year and the year before, and how we are so deficient in potassium. We get maybe 14% of our daily recommended intake. 14%, maybe. And potassium works so closely with sodium. And sodium, on average, we get 200%. So we dwarf our potassium with our sodium. And there's these active sodium potassium pumps in the body that just are so fundamental to moving things in and out of the cells, and to just normal they just inform every physiologic process. These little sodium potassium ATP pumps, and we destroy them with this with their functionality, with this massive sodium intake and this weeny potassium intake. In fact, we're the only mammals to flip the sodium potassium ratio. So all the other mammals on the planet ingest way more potassium than they do sodium, but we're the only ones who've switched it around. Not because we're supposed to, not because that's how we've evolved, because we've screwed it up with the diet. And I think if we were to do one little itty bitty thing, that would be to get enough potassium in our diets. Mm-hmm. And if you look at potassium, diseases associated with potassium, you'll see all of, the top 10 causes of disease. Arguably, you could put all of them on there, but particularly cardiovascular disease, diabetes,
glucose transport, right?
Potassium and sodium. They're such fundamental transport players. Any question you want to ask Mike and drill down, you'll see those guys involved. Yeah. And that's it. Just flip around your sodium and potassium intake.
Wow. Yeah, very simple. And potassium is very inexpensive.
It's very inexpensive. Well, and now potassium is something you can get in your food. Mm-hmm. I prefer food-based potassium, and my favorites are avocado. Avocado is a huge source. Just as an FYI, we need about 5 grams a day of potassium, maybe 4 to 5 grams per day to have adequate potassium. That's a lot of fruits and vegetables, but avocado is one of my favorite sources. Coconut water is also another great source of potassium. Sweet potato, all our green vegetables, our colorful vegetables, fruits and veggies, all have potassium. Melon is a good source of potassium. But that's one fundamental shift that we could, turn down the volume of complex chronic disease. Just that. Mm-hmm. Gosh, and then we get all of, I know, isn't it cool? It's easy.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Fitzgerald, thank you so much for being with us today. I know you're traveling tomorrow, and we really appreciate all your wisdom and great information here. But before we part ways, we want to make sure that our listeners can find you online and learn more about you. So I think you mentioned your website initially, but mention some of the social media channels in your website again so folks can contact you if they want to.
I would go to Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, DrKara Fitzgerald. You can go there, .com. That's my website, and all of these blogs are there. I have a Facebook page at the same name, and you should be able to, there's an Instagram and a Twitter, and I think it's all the same address. So people should be able to track me that way pretty easily. Yeah. Yeah.
And you do a great email, I think, on Saturday, or maybe it's Friday, but very informative once a week. So folks want to sign up for that because you'll get a bunch of great info. So,
okay.
Well, thank you so much again. This is great information. So I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.